Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We are on the Fadaa'il, the book of the virtues, particularly of the Prophet ﷺ. And this next chapter about the modesty or the shyness of the Prophet. Abu Sa'id al-Khudri reports that the Prophet was more modest than a virgin girl behind her curtain. And when he disliked anything, we could tell from his facial expression. Also, a narration from Abdullah ibn Amr describing the Prophet to a tabi'i. He says, the Prophet was never fahish, excessive, or immoderate in his speech and actions, وَلَا مُتَفَحِّشًا, and fuhsh was not part of his natural character. And the Prophet said, إِنَّ مِنْ خِيَارِكُمْ أَحَاسِنَكُمْ أَخْلَاقًا, the best of you are those with best character. These are two vital narrations about the character of the Prophet. The first one talks about his modesty. In those days, the virgin girls, who are not married off yet, would stay normally behind a curtain in the home. And normally they were the shy type because they did not have experience with men. Abu Sa'id tells us that the Prophet was even shyer. But shyness does not mean weakness. So if you see something which is evil, and you fail to enjoin the good and forbid the evil, or you fail to give nasiha, and this is not shyness, this is weakness. Likewise, asking questions to learn about the deen, and you're too shy to do that, this is not shyness, this is weakness. Aisha says, how good are the women of the Ansar. Their shyness or their modesty did not prevent them from learning about the deen. So, for example, when Sulaym asked the Prophet about a woman having a wet dream, normally women will be shy of such matters. However, this pertains to learning about your deen and rulings pertaining to tahara. You cannot be shy of such matters, even if you have to talk explicitly. Otherwise, we know from the authentic hadith that every Prophet taught his people, if you do not have any shyness, then do as you will. It is your modesty and your shyness which puts natural limits on your actions. In the second narration, the Prophet says, the best of you are the ones who have best character. So one asks the question, can we control our character then, so that we may become from the best? The answer would appear to be from the hadith that yes, you can, because if you cannot control your character, then what value does the hadith have? So it seems that you can work on your character. Maybe you're the type of person who gets angry or gets impatient and reacts in a violent way or a non-befitting way. That is something that you can work on. Maybe you use foul language or coarse language. Again, it is something that can be worked on. And so good character incorporates many aspects. For example, being patient with people, showing them mercy and love, being charitable, restraining yourself when you are feeling impatient or angry or enraged. As Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَالْكَاظِمِينَ الْغَيْظِ, and those who suppress their anger. وَالْعَافِينَ عَنِ النَّاسِ, and those who forgive or overlook other people's faults. وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ, Allah loves those who are good doers. So from character, there is some parts of the character which you're naturally born with. Some people are naturally forbearing, naturally compassionate. And then they have other parts of your character which you can work on. The next chapter about the Prophet smiling and his dealing with other people. Simak ibn Harb asked Jabir ibn Samurah, did you have the privilege of sitting in the company of the Prophet? And Jabir replied, yes, very frequently. And he described the Prophet, he says he would not get up from his prayer place in which he had prayed the Salat al-Subh until the sun had risen. And when the sun had fully risen, he would get up. And the Sahaba would enter into a conversation with one another, and they talked about those things which they did during the Jahiliyyah, and they would laugh, but the Prophet would only be smiling. We find from this narration that where the companions were laughing, so this would be an audible laugh, the Prophet was quietly smiling, and this was the laugh of the Prophet. He would smile, he would not have a right old belly laugh. So this laughing is much like salt on your food. You do need some sense of humor and some smiling or laughing. It needs to be in moderation, because too much will ruin your character. It's like too much salt on your food would ruin your food, even though a little bit of salt does actually improve the taste of your food. The next chapter, the mercy of the Prophet for women and his order to ride the camels slowly. Anas reports, the Prophet was on his way back from a journey, and there was a black servant by the name of Anjasha. He would make huda, that is to say, when you sing, to drive the camels along, because the camels respond to your singing voice. And Anjasha had a good voice, to which the camels responded. And the Prophet said to him, Rawaydan ya Anjasha, la taksir al-qawarir. Slowly, O Anjasha, meaning take your time. Do not break the glass bottles. What the Prophet meant here were the women. The Prophet likened the women to glass bottles because they shatter easily and you have to deal carefully with them. And indeed, women are such that you have to deal very carefully with them because they can shatter easily, they can take offense when you do not mean any, they are much more sensitive, emotionally and also physically. And it could be that the camels riding fast may hurt or injure the women who are riding on the camel. We also take a lesson here that you're allowed to sing to drive camels along. This is called al-huda. And singing without musical instruments and without making it a career for yourself is permissible, such as huda and such as lullabying your baby to sleep and so on, as long as the lyrics are okay. But the problem is when you do it on a regular basis as if you are a professional singer. This is not befitting, as it is not from the muru'ah, the manly qualities. And you can tell, oftentimes you find men singing, they try to soften their voice and make it effeminate. So this is a clear-cut sign that it goes against your muru'ah. The next chapter about how the Prophet was close to the people and how they would seek barakah from him. From Anas ibn Malik, he says, when the Prophet finished his subh prayer, the servants of Al-Madinah would come with containers with water, and the Prophet would dip his hands in them, and sometimes they would even come in the cold of the dawn, and he would still dip his hands in them. Another narration from Anas, when the barber would cut the Prophet's hair, the companions eagerly awaited the hair to fall, and they would catch it before it fell to the ground. Also, Anas reports that a woman had some derangement in her intellect, and she wanted to ask the Prophet about something, but not in front of everyone else. And so the Prophet said, "O Fulan, O mother of Fulan, look which side of the road you would want to go, and I will fulfill your request there." So the Prophet was alone with her in a particular side of the road and answered her request. So these are three narrations in the chapter, all by Anas ibn Malik. It tells us that the Prophet ﷺ had an accommodating attitude towards the people. He was not closed off from them. And also it gives us the idea of the trust that the people reposed in him. And the Prophet himself said that the one who mixes in with the people and is patient over their harms is better than the one who does not mix with them and is not patient over their harms. So this is the case if you are able to benefit the people, as the Prophet was able to do here. We find from the narration of the dipping the hand in the water after the Salatu Subh and the haircut that the people would seek barakah from the effects of the Prophet. So they would seek barakah from his hair strands that would fall when he had a haircut. They would seek barakah from the water in which he dipped his hand. This is all permissible. We also have a narration in which they would seek barakah from his sweat. They would turn it into perfume. That's how fragranted his sweat was. And this is permissible only from the Prophet, not from any other righteous person. The Sahaba did not do this with Abu Bakr, yet he is the most worthy after the Prophet. Now, the narration about the woman with some derangement in her intellect wanting to ask the Prophet something, the narration says that he was in privacy with her. So was the Prophet in privacy with an ajnabiyya woman? If that's the case, it would be allowed for us to be in privacy with an ajnabiyya woman, would it not? And the answer is that he was alone with her such that other people could not hear what they were talking about, because she had a question which was of a private nature, and she refused to let anyone else hear about it. But he was not alone with her such that other people could not see them. So that is to say, other people could see them because they were on one of the sides of the road. So others could see them but could not hear them. The next chapter about how the Prophet was far away from sin and choosing the easier course as long as it is halal. Aisha reports that whenever the Prophet would choose between two things, he adopted the easier one, provided there was no sin in it. But if there was sin, then he would be the furthest of all people away from it. And, she says, the Prophet never took revenge because of a personal vengeance, but rather only when the sacred limits of Allah Jalla wa Ala were violated. Taking revenge for personal reasons is permissible. However, the better way is not to take revenge and to forgive. And this was the way of the Prophet. وَإِنْ عَاقَبْتُمْ فَعَاقِبُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا عُوقِبْتُمْ بِهِ وَلَئِنْ صَبَرْتُمْ لَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لِلصَّابِرِينَ. So, being patient and forgiving others is better for those who are patient. One might ask, we took the hadith in the medicine chapter where they made ludud on the Prophet, putting the medicine down the side of the mouth, and the Prophet did not want that, and he said, لا يبقى أحد في البيت إلا لدة غير العباس فإنه لم يشهدكم. the Prophet ordered that everyone else have ludud done to them as well. Either we say that this was qisas, and hence the Prophet is taking revenge for his own personal self, and that would form as an exception to the general rule, or we might say that the Prophet did not intend revenge, rather he intended ta'zir, for when someone transgresses against somebody else's rights. The next chapter about the fragrance of the Prophet and his soft touch. Jabir ibn Samurah reports, he says the Prophet prayed the first prayer, then went out, and some children were in the streets, and he wiped the cheek of each one. He says he wiped my cheek and I felt a coolness or a scent, as if the Prophet had taken his hand out of the bag of a perfume seller. Also Anas ibn Malik says, I never smelt anbar, which is a type of scent, nor any misk, which had a better scent than the scent of the Prophet. And I never touched any type of thick nor thin silk, which was softer than the touch of the Prophet. So we find from these narrations that the Prophet had a constant scent about him, which was better than any misk, and he had a softness in his touch, softer than silk. So these are from his physical virtues. We know he has virtues in his character, but these are his physical virtues. The next chapter about the scent of the sweat of the Prophet, and deriving blessing from it. Anas ibn Malik reports that the Prophet would come to our house, and there was perspiration upon his body. He says, my mother, who is Sulaym, brought a bottle and collected the sweat in that. The Prophet was sleeping, and when he got up he asked, Sulaym, what are you doing? And she said, we are mixing your sweat with the perfume, so it becomes the most scented of all perfumes. This narration of the chapter does not have too much practical benefit for us, because it is not possible for us to collect the sweat of the Prophet and make perfume from it, as the Prophet is dead. And also we are not allowed to take the sweat of any other righteous man and make perfume from it and take blessing from it thereby, because like we said before, taking blessing is specific to the Prophet. The next chapter, the sweat of the Prophet in cold weather when the revelation descended upon him. Aisha reports that on a cold morning, revelation would come down and the Prophet's forehead would overflow in sweat. Also Ubadah ibn Samit, he says when the Prophet received revelation, the Prophet felt a burden on that account, and the colour of his face underwent some change. Also Ubadah ibn Samit reports, when the revelation came, the Prophet would lower his head, and the companions would also lower their heads, and when the revelation finished, the Prophet would raise his head. So these are some of the changes which the Prophet experienced. He would start to sweat, and he would lower his head, and the colour of his face would change. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, إِنَّا سَنُلْقِي عَلَيْكَ قَوْلًا ثَقِيلًا. We will send down to you a heavy word. So this is a heavy word, this revelation. Not any man can bear this burden. We find in Tafsir al-Tabari, commenting on this ayah, a narration where the Prophet's head was on the lap of Hudhayfa ibn al-Yaman when the revelation came to him. He says that his head became so heavy, it is as if his head was going to crush the thigh of Hudhayfa. Subhanallah, this revelation is not anything which just any man can bear. Also in the chapter, Aisha narrates that she asked the Prophet, how is this revelation? Meaning, how does it come to you? And the Prophet said, أحيانا يأتيني في مثل صلصلة الجرس. At times it comes to me like the ringing of a bell. وهو أشده علي, and it is the severest form on me. ثم يفصم عني وقد وعيته. Then it finishes from me, and I retain the revelation and grasp it. وأحيانا ملك في مثل صورة الرجل فأعي ما يقول. And sometimes it is an angel in the form of a human being comes and speaks to me, and I retain what he says. So in this narration and the chapter, the Prophet gives two ways in which he receives the revelation. The first is like the ringing of a bell, and this is severe upon him. Receiving the revelation is difficult, and it requires patience. And like we say, not just any man can bear it. Allah Jalla wa Ala says, فَاصْبِرْ لِحُكْمِ رَبِّكَ. Be patient on account of the decision of your Rabb. And in this there is a rebuttal against those kuffar who say that these revelations of the Prophet were simply seizures that he was having. No, they were not seizures. Seizures have a particular characteristics to them, and the Prophet's experience was not that of a seizure. This hadith mentions two methods. One is the wahi, which is like the ringing of a bell, The other one is simply an angel speaking to the Prophet. There is a third way, which the Quran mentions. مَا كَانَ لِبَشَرٍ أَن يُكَلِّمَهُ اللَّهُ إِلَّا وَحْيًا أَوْ مِنْ وَرَاءِ حِجَابٍ أَوْ يُرْسِلَ رَسُولًا فَيُوحِيَ بِإِذْنِهِ مَا يَشَاءُ. The third method mentioned here is that Allah directly speaks to this Prophet from behind a veil. And this we know happened to the Prophet when he was given the order of the 5 times prayer. Initially it was 50, but reduced to 5. Musa a.s. also spoke to Allah Jalla wa Ala directly, but from behind a veil. We also take the respect the Sahaba had for this revelation process in that they would also lower their head, even though they were not receiving the revelation. But because of this veneration and haiba, the fear that the Sahaba had, they would lower their head anyway. The next chapter about the hair of the Prophet. Ibn Abbas reports that the Ahlul Kitab used to let their hair fall down, and the Mushrikun would part them on their head. The Prophet preferred to imitate the people of the book, unless he was told not to. So the Prophet let his hair long, then afterward he began to part it. When the Prophet ﷺ first came to Al-Madinah, he would prefer to agree with the people of the book, unless he was prohibited from doing so. The people of the book made sadl of their hair, which is to say, comb it back, right to the back of the head. But then when many people entered Islam during the end of his life, he split his hair, just like the Mushrikeen would do, because there was no danger in the Muslims imitating the Mushrikeen now. So splitting the hair means combing half of your hair towards the right and the other half towards the left. But note that it does need to be half-half. So that is, the split is in the middle. The split should not be on one side. That is not the sunnah, if anyone wants to follow the sunnah here. As for if the split is on one side of the head, then some ulama have said that this comes in the hadith, which we took before, Nisa'un kasiyat, ariyat, ma'ilat, mumilat, inclining to one side. They said that the split of the hair inclines to one side. Well, some scholars have said this, that it is impermissible to split your hair from one side because of that hadith, and that's based on their interpretation of that hadith. It may be correct, it may not be. In any case, practically speaking, we say that if you are going to split your hair, then make it down the middle. This is better and safer. And if you do this with the intention of imitating the Prophet, then it will be reward-worthy because of your intention. Let us take the next chapter about the physical characteristics of the Prophet. Al-Bara reports that the Prophet was of medium height, having broad shoulders, with his hair hanging down to the lobes of his ears. He put a red mantle over him, and I have never seen anyone more handsome than the Prophet. The interesting point of discussion here is the red mantle. Is it permissible for men to wear red? We have already taken the narration in the book of clothing that the Prophet forbade Amr ibn al-As to wear red clothing. He was wearing some clothing of Usfur, which is the Mu'asfar clothing, that is safflower, which gives off a red color. The Za'afran also gives off a yellow color, and both of them are not allowed to be worn by men. So some scholars said red is absolutely not to be worn. Others said red can be worn because of this narration. Others said it is permissible to be worn in the house but not outside. Some have said if it is light red, it is okay. But if it is deep red or strong red, it is not okay. Others have said if it has red but other colors as well, then it is permissible, otherwise it is not. Others have said this hadith is specific to the Prophet, so he is allowed to wear it, but we are not. Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah says that what is haram is for a clothing to be purely red, but if it has some other colors in it, then it is allowed. And so this particular narration here about the red mantle would mean that the mantle had some red, but it had some other colors as well. Because if a color has, let's say, most of it being red, then you call it a red mantle. But that does not mean that it does not have some other colors as well. This mantle must have been a mantle with red stripes. However, note that if you have a red clothing which has some writing in non-red, let's say white or black, then is this permissible? We say no, because this writing of a different color is not to be considered as part of the color of the clothing. What we are dealing with is the original color of the clothing, not some external writing that is put on the clothing. Because with bleach or some other substance, you can wipe this writing off and you'll be left with the original red clothing. But that is on the opinion that wearing all red clothing for men is haram. Another good opinion is that only clothing dyed with usfur
and za'afran, which give off the reddish dye, are haram and not red per se. And this is also an opinion held by some major scholars, and it does seem to be a decent opinion, because what is prohibited for us is to wear clothing of the dye of usfur, because it is an imitation of the kuffar. But we know that women are allowed to wear such clothing, however. But if you want to be on the safer side and avoid all red, then there is no problem with that. And Allah knows best.
Okay, let's take the next chapter about the Prophet's hair. Qatada reports, I asked Anas about the hair of the Prophet, and he replied, his hair was neither curly nor straight. They reached between his ears and his shoulder blade. Some narrations tell us that they reached between the ears and the shoulder blade, like this narration. Some narrations say that they touched the shoulders. Some say they reached half of the ears. It's not a big deal. We know that the hair, they change in length as they grow. Of course, they're going to reach up to different levels. So basically, they reached up to his earlobes, give or take a little. That was the general area. The next chapter about the face of the Prophet, his eyes and heels. Jabir ibn Samurah reports that the Prophet had a broad mouth and reddish eyes and skinny heels. We have three characteristics in this narration. His mouth being broad, his heels having not much meat, so skinny heels. Shu'bah, one of the narrators, says, I asked Simak, another narrator, what ashkalul ayn means. These are the words in the narration. And Simak says that this means broad eyes. However, Al-Qadi Iyad says that this is a mistake on the part of Simak. Ashkalul ayn does not mean broad eyes. Rather, it means, as the ulama agree, that the whiteness of the eyes contains some redness. In those days, the Arab would find it more beautiful to have a broader mouth than a narrow mouth, and to have some redness in the whiteness of the eyes as well. So in the preceding narrations, we've learned that he had broad shoulders, he had broad mouth, he was of medium height, he had neither curly nor completely straight hair, coming up to about the earlobes, give or take a little. He had skinny heels, and he had some redness in his eyes. Let's take the next chapter, the Prophet's face being handsome and fair. Al-Jurayri asked Abu Tufail, did you see the Prophet? And he replied, yes. He was white and handsome looking. Muslim ibn Hajjaj says, Abu Tufail died in the year 100 Hijri. He was the last companion of the Prophet to die. So here we learn that the Prophet had a fair skin, and he was a handsome man. The next chapter about the white hair of the Prophet. Anas ibn Malik was asked, did the Prophet dye his hair? He replied that the Prophet had only a small amount of white hair, and Abu Bakr and Umar did dye their hair with hinna and katam. Also Jabir ibn Samurah says there appeared some white hair on the front part of the head and beard of the Prophet, but when he applied oil, it did not become visible. But when he did not apply oil, it became apparent. And he had a thick beard. A man said, did he have a face as shiny as a sword? Jabir said, no, it was round like the sun and the moon. And I saw the seal of prophethood near his shoulder blade, and its colour was the same as the colour of the rest of his body. So we find here that the Prophet did not usually dye his hair, but he would oil the hair with some colour, and that would get rid of the whiteness, or cover up the whiteness. But he certainly did not have all grey hair like you see with many people, such that you have to dye it. So his grey hair was not to that extent. He had some grey hair on the chin area, the temple area, and very little on the rest of the head. This is what we know from the narrations. We find his face being round and bright like the sun and the moon. The next chapter about the seal of the Prophet and its description and its place. Just previously, Jabir ibn Samurah said that the seal of the Prophet was on the back, and it was like a pigeon's egg, and it was near his shoulder blades. In this chapter, Abdullah ibn Sarjis says, I ate bread and meat with the Prophet, or he said tharid, which is bread soaked in soup. He was asked, did the Prophet seek forgiveness for you? And he said, yes, and for you. Because Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لِذَنْبِكَ وَلِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ وَالْمُؤْمِنَاتِ. Seek forgiveness for yourself and for the mu'mineen and mu'minat. So he's telling the questioner that he also sought forgiveness for you, O questioner, even if the Prophet did not meet you. And then Abdullah ibn Sarjis goes on to say, I saw the seal of the prophethood on the left-hand side of the shoulder, and it had some spots on it. So we find then that the seal of the Prophet looks like the shape of the pigeon's egg, and it is near the left-hand shoulder blade of the Prophet at the back. We know it's at the back because in the chapter, As-Sa'ib ibn Yazid says, I stood behind the Prophet and saw his seal. So it's at the back, it's towards the left shoulder blade, it looks like a pigeon's egg, it is of the same color as his body, and it has some spots on it. This is physical evidence that the Prophet is a prophet. But how is this an evidence that he's the Prophet? Well, because this seal of the prophethood has been mentioned in the previous scriptures. And this is exactly what Salman al-Farisi radiallahu anhu knew about from his study of the previous scriptures, that this prophet who is foretold, he's going to have this seal on his back. And this is why when Salman al-Farisi finally met the Prophet, he was searching for the seal at the back of the Prophet, and the Prophet knew about this and lowered his rida so Salman al-Farisi could see the seal. So this seal, just like the Prophet's description, is mentioned in the previous scriptures.
Also, just a couple of other points. The Prophet never took revenge for personal reasons. That does not mean that we cannot take revenge on behalf of the Prophet if the Prophet's honor is desecrated. It's just the Prophet would not do it because it would put people off embracing the deen of Islam. Otherwise, desecrating the honor of the Prophet is a violation of the limits of Allah Jalla wa'ala. Also, another point, the narration mentions that the Prophet was abyad, translates to white. This does not mean he was like a native European. When they use the word abyad, they mean he was brown-skinned but fair-complexioned. As for the Europeans, they would refer to them as asfar, translates to yellow. And this is just language. It is what it is.
Let's take the next chapter about the Prophet when he was sent as a prophet. Anas ibn Malik says, the Prophet was neither very tall nor very short. He was of medium height. And his color was neither strikingly white nor strikingly brown. And his hair was neither very curly nor very straight. Allah Jalla wa'ala commissioned him with prophethood when he was 40. He stayed in Mecca for 10 years and for 10 years in Al-Madinah. And Allah took him away, meaning gave him death, when he was at the age of 60. And there were not even 20 white hair strands
on his head and beard.
When it comes to the description of the Prophet ﷺ, Anas ibn Malik is very prominent in narrating these narrations. He was the personal servant of the Prophet, so no one would know about the physical qualities of the Prophet as he would, both in terms of the Prophet's physical qualities and the qualities of his character. Anas ibn Malik was extremely well acquainted. The Prophet was sent as a prophet at the age of 40. This age is not a coincidence, and it is not just some random age. This is the age when a man reaches his peak in terms of his intellectual level, physical strength, emotional strength, spiritual strength. He reaches his peak. This is the age of 40. So it is only fitting that the Prophet should become a prophet at that age, because you need to be at your peak to be able to carry the tasks and the burden of prophethood. He says that he stayed in Mecca for 10 years and in Al-Madinah for 10 years. Well, strictly that is not correct. He stayed in Mecca for 13 years and in Medina for 10 years. We know that because there's no difference of opinion that he died at the age of 63. Maybe Anas is rounding these numbers up. So 13 rounds to 10. And he says he died at 60. We know he died at 63. Perhaps he's rounding it up to 60, as would be the habit of the Arab. Also, we learn he barely had 20 hair strands on his beard. So that, compared to the rest of his beard, which was big and bushy, is hardly anything at all. And we know on his head as well, he had only a few white hair strands. The next chapter about the age of the Prophet when he died. Again, Anas ibn Malik says that the Prophet died when he was 63 years old, just like the age of Abu Bakr and Umar. All three of them died at the age of 63. Another narration like this is transmitted from Aisha. So this is an interesting narration because Anas ibn Malik here says 63, and in the very previous chapter he said at the age of 60. Therefore he must be rounding this up when he said 60. The correct age definitely is 63. And this was the age we learn also of Abu Bakr and Umar when they died. The next chapter about how long the Prophet stayed in Mecca and Al-Madinah. Umar reports that he says, I asked Urwa, how long did the Prophet stay in Mecca? He said, for 10 years. But then Umar says, I heard Ibn Abbas say that he stayed for 13 years. And then upon hearing this, Urwa sought forgiveness for Ibn Abbas, And he says that the statement of Ibn Abbas is based on the verse of a poet. And this is because there's a poet who wrote what translates to, "The Prophet lived amongst Quraysh for more than 10 years, and he exhorted them to do righteousness in order to find a co-worker." Also, in the chapter, Ibn Abbas reports,
The Prophet stayed in Mecca for 13 years and in Medina for 10 years and died when he was 63.
So, is it sunnah to die at the age of 63? Well, of course not. The sunnah which we are to follow is that which Allah Jalla wa Ala orders the Prophet to teach others. It is not pertaining to worldly and universal affairs. That can either be taken or left. We find that Urwa is wrong, even if Urwa deemed Ibn Abbas' statement to be wrong, he even sought forgiveness for Ibn Abbas for that mistake. But the mistaken one is Urwa, for the Prophet did not stay in Mecca for 10 years of a surety. He stayed for 13 years. Let it also be known to the mu'min that your age should not be about how many years you've lived, how many year cycles you have gone through, for that is outside your control. Your age really depends on what you have done in the years you have been alive on this planet, because your actions are much more in your control as they are part of your free will. So you would find a scholar like Al-Imam al-Nawawi, rahimahullah, who lived up to the age of only 45. But yet, when you see the works which he has left behind, you would think he lived up to the age of 90. What he did in his short life was something which many men could not do all put together, or which one man could not do even if he were to be resurrected 100 times over. Your lifespan depends on the works you have done, how you have served your deen, how you have served the sunnah of the Prophet and your Creator Allah Jalla wa Ala. That is what determines how long you have lived, not the number of yearly cycles that you have managed to survive. And note this because it is a manifest difference of mentality between the mu'min and the kafir. The next chapter about the names of the Prophet. Jubayr ibn Mut'im reports from his father that the Prophet said, "Ana Muhammadun, Ana Ahmad, Ana al-Mahi alladhi yumha bihi al-kufr, wa ana al-hashir alladhi yuhsharu an-nasu ala aqibi, wa ana al-aqib, wal-aqib alladhi laysa ba'dahu nabi." In this narration, the Prophet gives 5 names of his. The first one is Muhammad, that is obvious, and he says, "I am Ahmad," meaning the one who is most praised, and "I am Al-Mahi," which means the one who wipes out, and he says this is the one with whom kufr is wiped out, and he says, "I am the Al-Hashir, the one who gathers," he says, "at whose heels mankind will be gathered," and he says, "I am the Aqib, the one who comes afterwards, or the last one to come," and he says this because there will be no prophet after me. Also in other narrations of the chapter, he is called the Nabiyyu Tawbah, the Prophet of Repentance, and Nabiyyu Rahmah, the Prophet of Mercy. We all know that Allah Jalla wa Ala has many names, but the Prophet ﷺ also has various names and titles which are befitting to him. The next chapter about the Prophet's knowledge of Allah and the severity of his fear of Allah. Aisha reports, she says that the Prophet performed a particular action and he gave permission for this to be done. And the news of this particular action, which is not named in the narration, this news reached the companions and they did not approve of this particular action and stayed away from it. When the Prophet found out about this reaction of the companions, he stood up to give a sermon and he says, "ما بال رجال بلغهم عني أمر ترخصت فيه فكرهوا وتنزهوا عنه فوالله لأنا أعلمهم بالله وأشدهم له خشية." What is the matter that some news reaches the people about an action which I have approved of, yet they abstain from it and dislike it? For by Allah, I am the most knowledgeable amongst them of Allah and the one who has the most fear of Allah amongst the people. Now this particular action in the narration is unknown, but what we can infer is that some of these companions did not deem this particular action to be befitting before Allah Jalla wa Ala, and they felt that this is not a good action that will bring you closer to Allah. The Prophet became angry because people are giving precedence to their own opinions over what the Prophet has legislated and made permissible. The Prophet basically is saying, your opinion is not what counts. The only thing which counts in front of Allah Jalla wa Ala is what I have made permissible for you or made haram for you, because this is what you will be judged by, not your own opinion. And this leads us onto a great discussion of what the people call in English morality. This is complete and utter nonsense. It is not your morality that will gain you a favor with Allah Jalla wa Ala. Rather, it is only the commands and prohibitions of Allah Jalla wa Ala and respecting them thereby that will gain you favor with Him Azza wa Jal. People's morality is simply what their desires dictate to them. And you find people who are hooked up with morality are the worst ones to disobey Allah Jalla wa Ala. And the reason for that is because they give their morality precedence over what should be obeyed and what should not be obeyed. And they do not care about the ahkam of Allah Jalla wa Ala, because they've replaced the laws of Allah with their own moral framework. The Prophet here becomes angry because people are giving precedence to their own moral framework over what Allah and the Messenger have made permissible. Also, we find the good character of the Prophet in that he did not single out any one particular person, rather he just spoke to everyone as a whole. So he did not bring it down to a personal level, which many people nowadays are so infatuated with character assassinations, trying to score points over the other person just because maybe he is popular, his da'wah is gaining traction amongst the people, or whatever else the reason may be. So what many people do now is not from the character of the Prophet. Rather, it is just point scoring due to their hasad, their envy and their jealousy. Question: is the Prophet boasting and bragging here? He said, فَوَاللَّهِ لَأَنَا أَعْلَمُهُمْ بِاللَّهِ وَأَشَدُّهُمْ لَهُ خَشْيَةً. By Allah, I am the most knowledgeable out of all of them about Allah and have the most fear. If a person said that to you, would you not think that he is bragging or boasting? Is this not a rebukable characteristic? The answer is no. What is to be rebuked is if a person tries to make istitala over others. That is, tries to score points over other people to get ahead of them and looks down upon others. That is rebukable. What the Prophet is doing here, and it is your intention which matters, is that the Prophet is encouraging the people to follow the Sunnah. And this is fine. To encourage people to do the righteous actions which you are doing, this is okay. Or to encourage people to learn from you the righteous works which you are teaching, this is okay. Or just in order to teach people, this is okay. What is not okay is the ghamtun nas, as the Prophet said, to look down upon people, or batarul haq, to reject the truth. That type of boasting and bragging is not okay. Otherwise we find the Prophet here making fakhr, this type of boasting, but it is a righteous type. Other companions also have done the same thing. Ibn Mas'ud says that he knows where and when every ayah was revealed. If there is anyone who knows more than him, and it is possible to travel to him, he would travel. So Ibn Mas'ud here is in effect advertising his own ability and his own knowledge and understanding. This is not the rebukable type of boasting. Rather, this is to encourage people to learn from him because he knows exactly what he is talking about, as opposed to others who may not know what they are talking about. There have also been many scholars who have spoken highly of their own works. And this is not as an istitala upon other people, to look down upon others, but rather it is to encourage others to take from them because they know exactly what they are talking about. They're not being arrogant, rather, it is just having a brim full of confidence. The next chapter about the obligation of following the Prophet. Abdullah ibn Zubayr reports that a man from the Ansar had an argument with Az-Zubayr ibn al-Awwam. The argument was about a watering place which they used to water their date palms. The Ansari man asked Az-Zubayr to let the water flow, but Az-Zubayr refused to do so. They brought their case to the Prophet, and the Prophet said, "Isqi ya Zubayr, thumma arsil al-ma ila jarik." O Zubayr, use the water to irrigate your date palms and then pass the water along to your neighbor. And upon this decision, the Ansari man became angry. He said, "Ya Rasulullah, an kana ibna ammatik." O Messenger of Allah, you only gave this decision in his favor because he is the son of your paternal aunt. That is to say, he is your cousin. Upon that, the color of the Prophet's face changed, and he said, "Ya Zubayr, isqi, thumma ahbis al-ma', حتى يرجع إلى الجذر. O Zubayr, irrigate your plants and then keep the water back until the water rises up to the walls. And Az-Zubayr says, I think the ayah was revealed for this particular situation where Allah says, فَلَا وَرَبِّكَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ حَتَّى يُحَكِّمُوكَ فِيمَا شَجَرَ بَيْنَهُمْ ثُمَّ لَا يَجِدُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَرَجًا. By your Rabb, they will not have Iman until they make you the judge in their disputes, and thereafter find no grievance in their heart about what you have judged, and that they should submit fully. We find from this narration that you are allowed to give a judgment when in a state of anger, as long as your anger does not reach a level which would cloud your thinking, because if that's the case, you need to cool off. We find here the gravity of accusing the Prophet of nepotism, which is to show favoritism to your family members. Az-Zubayr was the son of Safiya, the paternal aunt of the Prophet. He is Az-Zubayr ibn al-Awwam. Showing nepotism in judgment is a blameworthy characteristic, an act even for a non-prophet. So how about for a prophet of Allah Jalla wa Ala? We also find from the narration you can give a ta'zir, as the Prophet did here, to the Ansari. May Allah Jalla wa Ala overlook his fault. Is the Prophet here getting angry because a personal attack on him is made? The answer is no. The Prophet is angry because this is an attack on his prophethood. The Prophet is giving a decision in his capacity as Rasulullah. He's not giving a decision in his capacity as Muhammad ibn Abdullah. So accusing the Prophet of nepotism will have repercussions on all other decisions which he gives in the Sharia. So it will, if you like, undermine all of his other decisions if it is established that he is unjust and unfair and shows favoritism in accordance with his personal whims and fancies. We take from the narration, and indeed from the ayah, that it is vital to make the Prophet the judge in all disputes, but not just that, you are not even allowed to find in your heart any grievance over what he has judged, and that you must submit completely. So this submission is outwardly and inwardly. Outwardly, that you submit to his decision, and inwardly, that you do not even find any grievance or felt hard done by, because this is the sign of the munafiqeen. They have no inward submission and have a grudge against the Prophet and the Sharia. The next chapter about venerating the Prophet and abandoning asking too many questions. Abu Hurairah reports that the Prophet said, مَا نَهَيْتُكُمْ عَنْهُ فَاجْتَنِبُوا وَمَا أَمَرْتُكُمْ بِهِ فَافْعَلُوا مِنْهُ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ فإنما أهلك الذين من قبلكم كثرة مسائلهم واختلافهم على أنبيائهم. Whatever I forbid you from, then abstain, and whatever I order you to do, then do it as much as you are able. For the only thing which destroyed those before you was asking too many questions and differing from their prophets. Note from this hadith that whatever is forbidden, you simply abstain from it. He did not say abstain from it as much as you are able to, nor rather you fully abstain from it. Whereas with the order or the command, you do it as much as you are able to. So you are forbidden from drinking wine. You do not say, well, I'll drink only a little bit and I'll abstain from much of it, but not all of it. No, rather you abstain from all of it. He says that which destroyed those before you, كَثْرَةُ مَسَائِلِهِمْ, asking too many questions, that is to say excessive questioning, where this is not even necessary. Such as, for example, Banu Israel asking Musa a.s. about the description of the cow. Excessive questioning, no need. What color is it? What does it look like? And all this type of thing. It's just a cow, slaughter a cow. Simple as that. Now carry out what you're commanded to do. Why would you ever need to ask more questions about its descriptions? This is useless questioning. The answers to these questions are simply going to make it more difficult for you to find that particular type of cow. وَاخْتِلَافُهُمْ عَلَىٰ أَنْبِيَائِهِمْ, that's the second point, differing with their prophets, disobeying their prophets. And these are the stubborn type of people who want to have it their way and find it too difficult to submit to Allah and the Messenger. Probably because they have their own moral frameworks which they are so infatuated with, worshipping their own desires. Also in the chapter, Amr ibn Sa'ad reports from his father that the Prophet said, إن أعظم المسلمين في المسلمين جرما من سأل عن شيء لم يحرم على المسلمين فحرم عليهم من أجل مسألته. The greatest sinner amongst the Muslimin, from the Muslimin, is the one who asks about a matter which was not haram upon the Muslimin, but then it became haram due to his questioning. So the type of questioning that is rebuked is the questioning for which there is no particular need and you're just burdening these questions on yourself, or a type of questioning which is to put someone else in a difficult situation and to give them a hard time? That is the questioning to be rebuked. But a questioning to genuinely learn the matter and the question is needed, then that is the questioning that is encouraged. As Allah Jalla wa Ala says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. So takalluf and ta'annut, these are two words and two concepts you have to avoid. Takalluf is when you burden your own self with matters you ought not to be burdening yourself with, such as, for example, asking about how the attributes of Allah manifest. These matters about the unseen, you do not need to know, you're just burdening yourself with extra burden. When you're delving deeply into a matter you should not be delving into, you should be refraining from such an action and steering clear. If these types of affairs were important for us, Allah Jalla wa Ala would have made it plain. How does Allah Jalla wa Ala descend to the lowest heaven during the last third of the night when He's above His throne? How can He do that at the same time? And is He always then descended during the last third of the night? Because somewhere on the planet there's always going to be a last third of the night. Allah Jalla wa Ala has fingers. Okay, how many fingers? These types of questions are useless. And it is all takalluf, burdening yourself. And then we have ta'annut, which is to give the answerer a hard time. And this is the type of thing the Yahud would do. Try to ask him questions and test him, see where he makes a mistake, see where he slips up, so you can expose him. And try to phrase the question in such a way which could make the answerer slip up. A great example is with the Sahaba. When the Prophet told them, Ad-Dajjal will stay for 40 days, the first day will be like a year, the second like a month, third like a week, and the rest will be like normal days. This is clearly amazing. Notice how they did not ask, how can one day be like a year? They did not ask this. They know it is going to happen, the Prophet said so. We don't need to ask about the details as to how this will be. Rather, they did ask the Prophet a question, but the question they asked was pertinent to them, to their everyday living. They asked about the Salah. How shall we pray? 5 prayers, or shall we estimate them? And the Prophet told them to estimate. In the chapter from Anas ibn Malik, the Prophet led them in the Dhuhr prayer and then stood up and said, anyone who has a question, ask me about anything. I will not move from this place until I answer your questions. The Sahaba began to shed tears when they heard the Prophet say this. Abdullah ibn Hudhafa stood up and said, who's my father? The Prophet replied, your father is Hudhafa. And the Prophet said repeatedly, ask me. And at this, Umar knelt down saying, we are pleased with Allah as our Rabb, and with Islam as our code of life, and with Muhammad as our messenger. Then the Prophet said, the doom is near. By the one who has the soul of Muhammad in his hand, Jannah and the fire were displayed to me just now, in the nook of this enclosure. And to this day, I did not see the good and the evil like that. Allah Jalla wa Ala sent down the ayah, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu la tas'alu an ashya'a in tubda lakum tasu'kum. O believers, do not ask about matters which, if made plain to you, would annoy you. An example of this is when the Prophet told the people to perform Hajj, and one man asked, is it every year? And the Prophet said, if I said yes, it would become wajib, and you would not be able to do it. The Hajj is only once, and anything beyond that is optional. He said to him, leave me where I leave you, because that which destroyed those who were before you was asking too many questions and differing from their prophets. However, nowadays, after the wahi, after the revelation has stopped, we know that nothing can be made haram or halal after that. So if a person asks about something now, the ruling will not change. So this hadith which talks about the greatest sinner amongst the Muslimin, this hadith pertains to the period of the revelation, which would be the 23 years of the prophethood. Because if you ask about matters you ought not to be asking and the Prophet answers in a particular way so as to make the matter worse or more haram than it already is, that will make life more difficult amongst the Muslims. So during the period of the revelation, the matter was stricter, because the point is that this question of yours can actually backfire on all the rest of the Muslims, in that a particular matter becomes haram where before your question it was halal. So you make the situation worse. As for Abdullah ibn Hudhafa, then people used to attribute him to other than his father, and he wanted to make sure about this with the Prophet as to who his father was. And in the narration, his mother rebuked him from doing so. In fact, she says, I have not seen a more disobedient child than you, because you could have potentially humiliated me in front of everyone.
Because no woman wants to be known as someone who has brought someone else's child into the family. Let's just take a few more points of benefit with regards to the names of the Prophet ﷺ. We have learnt of some in Sahih Muslim. We came across 7 in total, and yet the Quran has even more names and titles accorded to the Prophet. So we learn of Al-Shahid, Al-Mubashir, Al-Nadhir, Al-Mubin, Al-Da'i ila-Allah, Al-Siraj Al-Munir, Al-Mudhakkir, Al-Rahmah, Al-Ni'mah, Al-Hadi, Al-Shahid, Al-Amin, Al-Muzzammil, and Al-Muddathir. And in other narrations we have Al-Sadiq Al-Masduq, Al-Mutawakkil, Al-Mukhtar, Al-Mustafa, Al-Shafi' Al-Mushaffa'. So you see there are many names and titles given to the Prophet. Also, with regards to the last hadith which we have mentioned about the Prophet telling people to ask me anything, the reason for this is because the people were pressing the Prophet with questions. After all, he's the Prophet, he should be able to answer everything. And so they essentially harassed him with questions. This made the Prophet angry. So he stood up on the minbar, addressing everyone and saying, "Okay, go ahead then. Ask me anything you want. I will not back down." And the Prophet was angry. And this is what made the Sahaba cry when they saw that the Prophet was suffering. And this is what made Umar say that we are happy with Allah as our Rabb, and with Islam as our deen, and with Muhammad as our Prophet. So you see that the companions had so much compassion for the Prophet, and they could easily detect when he was suffering. Okay, let's end with some review questions. So question number 1. Give 3 examples how the people would take blessings from the effects of the Prophet. Question number 2. When the Prophet received the wahi, certain changes would happen to him. State at least 3 changes. Question number 3. We stated that 2 types of questions are haram. Recall those 2 types. Give the words in Arabic and what they mean. Question number 4. Describe the nature and position of the seal of the Prophet.